start, huh? You think so?
Sure.
You have to
I
unmute
unmuted
yourself.
myself.
All right, okay. I'll start then.
Hi, everyone. This is Kendall Williams. Welcome to the Sifter of Dust podcast. This podcast is an edited recording of a discussion that we had in what we call the Tea House, which we host every Thursday night through Zoom and advertised on the Sifter of Dust website. In these early Tea House discussions, we've been presenting the basic Baha'i concepts, and so there's a little bit less discussion and a little bit more presentation in these first few. In this first one, I gave a presentation on the Baha'i concept of the oneness of religion. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and please join us for Tea House anytime.
And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kendall, and he'll give a short presentation on the Baha'i concept of the oneness of religion.
So hi, folks. I hope you all can hear me. Shake your head if you can. Great. So I'm going to just give hopefully a brief introduction to the Baha'i concept of the oneness of religion as I understand it. But the great thing about this is that it's a discussion and others will be able to chime in and say how they perceive this as well. I have this professorial attitude, it's my day job. So I've always tend to be a little bit overly structured. But I think it's important to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So my talk will really approach this topic of the oneness of religion in a very structured way. So, if you were to say to somebody knowledgeable in the modern day, all religions are the same, or all religions are one, and you weren't to qualify that in any way, a lot of people would disagree with you because it's obvious that religions have a lot of differences between them, right? If we look cross-sectionally across the world, if we went from one church one day, went to a synagogue the next week, went to a mosque the next week, went to a Hindu temple the following week, we would see a lot of differences in terms of basic metaphysics, in terms of ethical teachings, rituals, and traditions, and so forth. It'd be very different, even though we might feel that there's some common themes. When Baha'is talk about the oneness of religion, though, we're not talking about sort of how religions are practiced today. We're being asked to actually looking at them within the context of history, as how they were revealed and how they came about within the context of history, because that's what the Baha'i concept is. It's not that all religions are the same today, it's that they had a common purpose within the context of history, which is why I thought it was important to actually talk about the great history of these religions so that we can understand this idea. So all the major religions of the world, meaning those that the top 5 or 6 that encompass the largest numbers of people on the planet, come from this area of the map, okay? So we're talking about Europe, the Middle East, China, India, North Africa, and so forth. And so all of the major religions really come out of this area. So I want to be coming back to this map from time to time just to sort of orient us geographically, not only in history, but geographically where these religions come from. The ones that Baha'is believe are actually all part of one faith. So, and we're going to start with 1,000 years before Jesus Christ, so 3,000 years ago. And of course, in 3,000 years ago, Islam didn't exist, Christianity didn't exist, right? All that existed were, most of the world was tribal religions, but there were some foundational platform religions, if you will, out of which other religions grew that spread more widely around the world. So if we look at the Indian subcontinent, for instance, the area of the world that encompasses now what is now Pakistan and India. So the people of that time had migrated down from sort of the Aryan steppes, the Mongolian steppes area, had come into that culture, and they had an ancient religion which has come to be known as Hinduism. Hinduism is really sort of a collection of faiths that it's really the religion of the Indian subcontinent, and that was really actually quite diverse. But ancient Hinduism was focused on rituals as expression of service to the gods. And as Hinduism developed within India, it did begin to increasingly focus on moral life and duty. But in the early days, it was very ritualistic focused. The other religion that was present in the 1,000 years before Christ was a religion called Zoroastrianism, which is still present in the world today. It is the ancient religion of the Persian Empire, and it's centered on the prophetic figure of a man named Zoroaster that we know very little about historically, but it was a monotheistic religion that was focused on the duty of doing good deeds for the sake of goodness alone. And then, of course, we had what is probably more commonly known of the Semitic religion. At this time, it would have been the Israelites worshiping one God, particularly centered on the prophetic figure of Moses, who lived probably about 1,300 years before Jesus. And, you know, we all know the story of Moses, or you've heard it, or you've watched Charlton Heston play Moses on TV. You know, he went up to the Mount Sinai when he was leading the people out of Egypt, received a revelation from God through the burning bush, and then brought the 10 Commandments to the people, which then became the foundations of the Hebrew civilization for the next 1,000 years. A civilization that really influenced a lot of the, not only what happened afterwards and continues to influence what happened afterwards, but also the people of that time. So those were the three sort of ancient platforms. I did not mention China. China had a rich history as well, very significant religious history that's also very interesting. In about 500 years before Jesus, there seemed to be an awakening of human consciousness around the world. And it was reflected in different movements that occurred throughout different cultures that some historians, or a famous historian in particular, has termed the axial age. It was this time when these individuals arose and began to promote religions and philosophies of great influence that really highlighted various paths to express sublime virtues in society and action. So you had the Buddha in India, you had the Greek philosophers in Greece, Socrates, Plato, and the other Greek philosophers, the flowering of rational and the flowering of, you know, rationality during that time. Confucius in China, who was reviving an ancient path and really set the structure for a lot of Chinese civilization at that time. And then the Hebrew prophets that had followed after Moses were still also having a great impact as well. But, you know, at that same time, probably the first universal religion grew up, and that is Buddhism. And so all other religions before this time were generally located to one people only, or one tribe only. When we say a universal religion, we mean a religion that actually transcended boundaries of race or national area and really spread. So Buddhism was actually the first. And, you know, it started with this magnificent figure of the Buddha, who was a wealthy young man who left his home to seek enlightenment. And, you know, if you've seen these statues, if you've been to East Asia, you've seen many statues of the Buddha, but this is a famous one. And what it's depicting is that the Buddha had gone to meditate under the Bodhi tree, and he was meditating and seeking a path to enlightenment. And he was fighting with this serpent, this mythical serpent, who represents good and evil within him. And he finally suppressed that, and he touched the ground, and the ground shook, and a new path was born into the world. And that's the idea that was brought. That's how Buddha was perceived, as bringing something into the world that was beautiful and new and true. And his fundamental idea was that the world that people experience, the world of everyday reality, is so transient that you can't find happiness by setting your hearts on it. You needed to go inward and find the eternal. And the Buddha himself refused to dwell on any theological questions. Buddhism is somewhat controversial because it's sometimes said to be almost an atheistic religion. It's not true that it's atheistic in the sense that it didn't believe in God. It doesn't talk about God. It was focused more on the inner spiritual journey of individuals. And the Buddha said that he did this because there was so much theological confusion in his time. He wanted to give people a path that was simple and straightforward that they could follow. And he described himself specifically as a physician who was laying down a path to heal the problems that he saw in the world at that time. So, and the Buddhist religion has been so foundational really to mystical thought in all religions after that, and is the first universal religion of humankind. Now, 500 years after the Buddha, so the Buddha's in India, and his religion spreads up into China and goes over into the Vietnam and Japan and so forth. Now, it spreads eastward. Now, around here was the Hebrew civilization, right? On the banks of the Mediterranean, what is now modern day Palestine or Israel. In this area, this is where the Hebrew peoples were. And in and around Jerusalem, this was a Roman territory at the year 0, which is the time of the birth of Jesus Christ. But they already, the Jewish people had a very strong connection with this idea of one God, which was unusual at that time because most of the world was polytheistic. But they were really setting a pattern that would become a pattern that would flower into the future, into the great religions we'll talk about here in a moment. But the first great sort of universal religion that spread around the world is Christianity itself. And, you know, I think it's important now that we know so much about Christ and so much about his influence on the world to kind of look back and how he described himself, because it's going to become important when we talk about the Baha'i concept of the oneness of religion. You know, first of all, Jesus said that his teaching was not his own, right? He says it comes from him who sent me. So he did not claim to be God in the sense the direct, he claimed to be bringing something from God. And then he also tied his teaching directly in to the beliefs of the people of that time and the religions that existed before them. He explicitly didn't deny the truth of the religions that existed before him at all. In fact, all he said is that he was a fulfillment of the religions before him. Famously, he said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And then Jesus also brought an ethic into the world that was a higher standard, if you will, of human behavior. He was challenging people to follow a higher standard. And this is throughout the Gospels, but this is one passage where Christ said, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." So he was really revealing a new standard and telling the people of that time that humanity in the eyes of God was expected to live by an even higher standard than they had before. And there are several passages in the Gospels that reflect this theme. So, you know, Jesus's influence on civilization is so immensely profound. You know, he really changed morality so that the right thing to do to care for the others, you know, care for others more than yourself, love your neighbor more than yourself, and so forth, care for the poor. And this ethic of Jesus has profoundly changed our civilization all over the world, really. So much of what we think, and even our politics and how the policies we discuss have been influenced by the teachings of Jesus Christ that were so profoundly different than what anybody had seen before, and created within people such courage to spread his religion up into Europe and beyond, really. So Christianity is now the largest religion in the world. But of course, I wanted to point out that Christ spoke his religion within the context of the people. He fulfilled what they believed before, and is claimed to be the fulfillment, and brought a higher standard. So 600 years after Jesus, there was another claim to divine authority. By the time 600 years had passed, Christianity had made its largest initial spread into Europe. Most of Europe was Christian after about 600 years. I mean, at least nominally Christian. And so its initial spread had ended. It would then spread around the globe in 1500 when a lot of the European countries began to colonize and imperialize and so forth. But Christianity's real spread and real dynamic growth was in those first 600 years. After which a figure appeared now in the Middle East, right? So we have Christ here moving up into this region of the world, the Buddha starting here, moving up into this region of the world. And now we have the Prophet Muhammad in years around the mid 600, 7th century, revealing a religion that he called Islam. And that would then spread over all of the Middle East up into these areas and really become the largest religion in the world in a few hundred years. So the Prophet Muhammad, it's interesting if we ask ourselves, what did he teach? So he described himself. So the Quran is revealed from the voice of God. And so it speaks to the prophet with the voice of God, even though the prophet is the one that is speaking the words. So God says, "O prophet, we have sent thee as a witness and as a bearer of glad tidings, and as a warner, and as a summoner to God by his command, and as a lamp that gives bright light." This description that the Prophet Muhammad had for himself, also from the Quran, he describes this idea of Islam and describes it as, he says, "Today I have perfected your religion for you," speaking to his followers. "I have completed my blessing upon you. I have approved Islam for your religion." And what the Prophet Muhammad meant by Islam, Islam means submission, submission unto God. And what the Prophet Muhammad said is that all of the religions that existed before him, all the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, Jesus, prophets that we don't even know anything about, but were known to the Arab peoples at that time, all of them were united in one common religion. And that religion was submission unto God. And he said, if you want to be like them, you have to submit as well. And so Islam became this process of all humanity sort of submitting their will to the will of God, and thereby being enlightened and be filled with knowledge and truth. And that was the spirit of Islam. It was an extremely universal religion for its time, because the Prophet Muhammad accepted that revelations and prophets had come to people all over the world. And he said they were all Islam, because they all submitted to the one God. And so for the Prophet Muhammad, all the religions that existed were really expressions of the same one truth. And so it was really the most universal vision of religion that had ever been known. And his ethic was really very similar to Jesus. So this passage, "And hasten towards forgiveness from your Lord, and toward a garden as broad as the heavens and the earth, prepared for the conscientious, for those who are generous in good times and bad, and those who pardon people, for God loves those who do good." The message of Islam was extraordinarily effective, and it spread like wildfire, because people saw within it a way that they could unite across previous barriers that existed. It didn't recognize racial barriers. You know, the Prophet Muhammad said in the voice of God, or God said in the Quran, God said, "If I had wanted, I would have made you all one people. That I love the diversity of you, and so I created you in different shades and colors." So this was a really beautiful universal religion. And it was also the first religion that had its writings written down directly from the prophet. And so it's the first religion that was actually written down. Everything we know about the Buddha, everything we know or don't know, really going back even to Moses, is based on verbal handed of tradition down through the generations. The Prophet Muhammad was the first revelation, if you will, first religion in which everything is written down. So there's a great deal of emphasis in the religion of Islam on the words themselves having creative power. And in this passage here, that the prophet says, "God sent you a book with the truth, confirming the truth of what preceded it. And God sent the Torah and the gospel before, and God sent the criterion." And I don't know what he means by the criterion, but that passage clearly shows that the Prophet Muhammad claimed to be revealing a religion that fulfilled the religions of the past and was really no different in substance from the religion that had been brought before. And Islam is a beautiful faith, and there's beautiful ideas in it. You know, it really created this connection between the word of God as revealed and also the revelation of God that exists in all creation. And the prophet encouraged people to look at the world and say, "Oh Lord, you have not created this in vain." So a beautiful religion that built upon what Christianity had started and what Judaism had started. So if we turn back to our map here, after, let's say 1500, after a lot of this religions had spread, Islam was all throughout here, largest religion in the world in the 1500s. India, some of it was Buddhist, most of this now was Buddhist. Christianity had come over Europe and started to spread to other parts of the globe. So, at this point, you have three universal religions that we now see as the great religions of humanity. But keep in mind that they built upon foundations that were built before them. So that's why I wanted to do this talk. And so we see religions in history because they're building upon teachings that were before them. So my main points are that each religion, particularly Christianity, Islam, when they claimed divine revelation, they expressed it in the context of the other religions known to the people of that time. And that each claimed that it was a fulfillment of the revelations of the past, and that belief in the new revelation was the same as belief in the previous. Each claim to revelation, if you follow through from Judaism, Prophet Moses, for instance, to Jesus, to the Prophet Muhammad, each is a broader one, the one that existed before, encompassing more of religious history and more people. Each claimed similarly the same ethical ideas, the same spiritual ideas in many ways, that human life is fundamentally ethical and spiritual. And they all produced a great leap forward themselves in human civilization, unifying more and more people under a common ethical system. In Atul Harari's book that it was popular a few years ago called Sapiens, he said only three things have united the world. Money, because everybody needed to share a common money to be able to trade. Empires, where empires would conquer and unite people under a common administrative structure. And the universal religions of Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. So they've had an enormous impact upon our world. So if you look at this map and you just see these areas of the world, there's one area of the world that sort of stands out, right? And that's this country called Iran, which is historically known as Persia. And so it's kind of in the middle of everything, right? I mean, all of this activity going up here in Europe and all of the Middle East and India that flows through here and up into China. I mean, Iran's right in the middle of it. So if you would imagine a new revelation would come to humanity that would be even more unifying, even more universal than that of Islam, where would it come? Well, it makes a lot of sense that it would come from this spot because there's so much going on there. There's a richness of cultural history. And the mysticism that came out of India, was replicated in the Sufi poets and the mystical poets of Persian culture and so forth. So when a universal religion were to come out of that area of the world, it would really hit a lot of the major themes of the great religions of humanity. And of course, that's what we believe as Baha'is has happened, that Baha'u'llah in 1863 formally declared his mission. And I could have chosen many quotes to describe Baha'u'llah's description or to use for Baha'u'llah's description of this. But he said about his revelation, he said, "The revelation which from time immemorial hath been acclaimed as the purpose and the promise of all the prophets of God, and the most cherished desire of his messengers, hath now by virtue of the pervasive will of the Almighty and at his irresistible bidding been revealed unto men." So Baha'u'llah explicitly connects his religion to not only the revelations of Christ and Muhammad, but all of the revelations of God in the past, and says the purpose and the promise was to really build for the next revelation. And so all of them wished that they could live in the day of the next revelation. And that's what Baha'u'llah is saying. And Baha'u'llah then reveals to us that we should look not upon the creatures of God except with the eye of kindliness and mercy, because in this day, the loving providence of God has pervaded all created things, and the grace of God has encompassed the earth and the heavens. So Baha'u'llah's religion, as many of you probably know, is a religion of peace and unity. It reflects that this is a celebratory time in human history, when it's really the culmination of historical processes that have brought us to this phase. And so the fundamental concept in the Baha'i faith, that when we talk about the oneness of religion, what Baha'u'llah is telling us, I believe, is that if we look at the evolution of religion, everything has built upon things before. And every prophet, if you will, however you want to call them, has said that his religion was fundamentally the same as the ones that before. There's no circumstance in which Jesus or the Prophet Muhammad or Baha'u'llah says anything bad at any time about any of the other revealers of the great religions. They speak with them with the utmost respect and honor. Baha'u'llah, though, has done, I think, 2 or 3 great things, actually. One, not only has he claimed a new revelation, which really validates the truth of the process, but he's also helped us understand the process itself. So, and there are many passages that talk about this central theological idea of progressive revelation. So I chose this one. I love it. The Baha'u'llah says, the bearers of the trust of God, that's a term that means the prophets of God, are made manifest to the peoples of the earth as the exponents of a new cause and the revealers of a new message. So every one of these prophets, messengers, however we want to refer them, Baha'is call them manifestations of God, come and they bring a new message. Inasmuch as these birds of the celestial throne, this is a term also, Baha'u'llah uses so many beautiful terms to describe the nature of the messengers of God, but this is one of them. Birds of the celestial throne are all sent down from the heaven of the will of God as they all arise to proclaim his irresistible faith, which Baha'u'llah says is one faith. They should be regarded as one soul in the same person, for they all drink from one cup of the love of God and all partake of the fruit of the same tree of oneness. And then he says something really important. He says, every divine revelation has been sent down in a manner that best befitted the circumstances of the age in which it hath appeared. So we can understand some of the differences that exist between religions because they come out of different historical frameworks, right? They come at different times in history with different needs and different challenges, different standards. So, and every revelation sort of builds upon the standards of the previous one. And Baha'u'llah's contextualized religion. So this is an evolutionary view of religion. It's the first time that it's been said so explicitly. But as I showed in those previous ones, it's there in Christianity and certainly in Islam as well. And it's also there in the early books of Hinduism. And even the Buddha said he was revealing, he was bringing a path and just trying to revive an ancient path that had been lost. Baha'u'llah gives us many beautiful examples to describe the messengers of God and how we should think about them. One of them is the same analogy that the Buddha gave, and that the prophets of God should be regarded as physicians whose task is to foster the well-being of the world and its peoples, that through the spirit of oneness, they may heal the sickness of a divided humanity. Every time that they've come to the world and have illumined the world with the resplendent radiance of the day star of divine knowledge, they've invariably summoned its peoples to embrace the light of God through such means as best befitted the exigencies of the age in which he appeared. So it's the same idea that every religion comes into the world and is expressed in a manner that is most befitting to the age in which it appears. It's because they speak to the people in a way that people can understand, that they were able to scatter the darkness of ignorance and shed upon the world the glory of their own knowledge. So Baha'u'llah then tells us, he says it's towards the inmost essence of these prophets, therefore, that the eye of every one of discernment should be directed, inasmuch as their one and only purpose has always been to guide the erring and give peace to the afflicted. So they're great teachers, right? Great unifiers that bring goodness and light and beauty into the world in a transcendent voice. It's amazing. So, the core principles, I think, of the Baha'i idea, Baha'u'llah, that he revealed of the oneness of religion is that even though religions differ because of their historical circumstances, because of how they've developed in history, they've all changed dramatically from their source, sometimes in ways that are consistent with their origin, sometimes not. But Baha'u'llah says the revelations of God will have the same source and core purpose, that of unity and the spiritual and moral development of all people. That they're revealed according to the capacity of humanity at that time in history, that they're evolutionary, building upon the truths of previous revelations. But the specifics of their teachings, the mode of their presentation, other aspects depend upon the language and context of the people at that time in history. But despite those differences, the underlying truth is the same, and all of them represent the Word of God. And Baha'u'llah tells us that in this time in history, God wants us to recognize their fundamental oneness and not separate ourselves on the basis of the superficial aspects of religion. And that's where the Baha'i concept of the oneness of religion, I think, is so key. So that was my presentation on the oneness of religion. We edited out a lot of the discussion just for time purposes, but please join us live to participate in that discussion. There's a Baha'i concept of the oneness of religion part 2 that you can find coming out shortly, if it's not already on the website. I want to thank Mr. Paul Parrish, whose music we use for the intro and the outro of our podcast. I put a slide in the video version of this podcast that tells you where you can get Paul's amazing music. Thank you to all for joining. See you next time.
Thou art my lamp, and my light is in thee. Get thou from it thy radiance, and seek none other than me. For I have created thee rich, and bountifully shed my favor upon